This is becoming a habit. Guess who recorded 20 minutes of book reviews and forgot to turn on her microphone again? Hi guys, it's Steffi from the Novelty Corner. Welcome back to my channel. I'm feeling like a real dill because this is like the third or fourth time I've done this, where I filmed an entire video and got to the end and gone, you didn't turn the microphone on, Steph. And it's so heartbreaking when that happens. But that aside, we're going to do this again. Hopefully I can do it just as well as I did the first time, because I thought I did a really good job the first time, so now I have to start again. But welcome to my weekly wrap up for the week of June the 11th to June the 17th. This week I read 5 books and 1,626 pages. My yearly reading total is at 121, which is pretty good. I'm really happy with that. This week I read a mixture of the sci-fi books that I had in my June TBR for the Emoji-a-thon, as well as some junior and middle grade fiction, just to break it up. It was a really good reading week. I really enjoyed everything that I read. There was nothing really that stood out to me as being something that I didn't enjoy. So I'm going to get straight into it and hopefully we can get through this. The first book that I read this week was Leila, Queen of Hearts by Glenda Millard. This is the second book in the Kingdom of Silk series, and last week I read The Naming of Tishkin Silk, which was the first book. So if you haven't read that, check out my last week's review. And this is the story of Leila, who is the best friend of Griffin Silk, and her school is having a senior citizens day and all the children are encouraged to bring along a grandparent or an elderly friend to the day. Leila wants to take someone really special, and it's then that Miss Emily comes into her life. Leila and Griffin both have to learn the importance of memories and generosity and kindness as they go on this journey with their new friendship with Miss Emily. This series, I can tell, is going to be a happy, sad series the whole way through. All of the books have a lot of hope and a lot of joy and a lot of love and a lot of kindness in them, but there's always a story underpinning it that is quite sad and is likely to leave you in tears, and this didn't disappoint in that aspect. It deals with Alzheimer's, it deals with loss, and it deals with children being resilient and understanding in ways that adults usually aren't in similar situations. Ultimately, I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I think these books are really important for kids because they need to see that sad things do happen in life, but they're not the only thing that happen. And even in sadness, sometimes there is this kernel of hope that continues on, and Glenda Millard is doing a beautiful job so far in this series of sharing that. I've actually ordered the entire series. I think there's 7 books in the series, so I'm waiting for them to arrive, and I'm so excited because I want to read the rest of the books. Then I read Starflight by Melissa Landers. This is a young adult science fiction book, and it is set in space. It is essentially a young adult version of Firefly, and it was wonderful. Our main character, Solara Brooks, is trying to escape to the outer planets to begin a new life for herself. However, traveling through space is expensive, and in order to pay for her passage off-world, she has to put herself into the service of Doran Spalding, who is a student from her former school who she cannot stand. But as long as she works as his valet while he is traveling, she has her passage and board paid for. However, along the way, Doran is framed for murder and finds himself on the run, and Solara has to con him into basically becoming her servant aboard the Banshee, a ship that is run by Captain Rossi and crewed by a crew of teenagers, all with mysterious pasts that are slowly revealed as the book goes on. This was just a fun adventure book and I really enjoyed it. Everyone is running from someone in this on this ship. Everyone is bound by their past, and it was just highly enjoyable, and it was fun and it was easy to read, and if you like space dramas, definitely pick this one up. I think Melissa Landers had a really nice way of writing. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed it. Then I read Leviathan Waste, which is the first book in the Expanse series by James S.A. Corey, which is the pseudonym of 2 authors who write this series, and it's a big series, and I'm kind of wishing that I hadn't started reading it because now I really want to read it, which means I need to go out and get all the other books, which defeats the purpose of me trying to get through all my science fiction TBR this month. I think I'm going to be good. I think I'm going to hold off for a little while, but I do want to actually continue this series because I really enjoyed it. I've actually seen the Netflix series The Expanse, and because of that, I actually knew about 3/4 of the story. There are slight changes, and this obviously goes into more detail behind characters' thinking and everything that goes on in that time period. But for the most part, It was very similar, and I liked the way that after I got through what I'd seen on the show, there was still more, and there was a lot more explanation about everything that had happened, which I think must be taking place in the second series of the show. In this world, humanity has colonized the solar system, so people are still living on Earth under the United Nations. There are people living on the moon, on Mars, and in the asteroid belt. But those areas are the main strongholds of humanity in the solar system. There are factions of people who are trying to push further and further out and go and reach the stars, and there are other people who are quite content to work. What's really interesting is that these different factions also have different sort of socioeconomic statuses. So Earth and Mars are quite wealthy, quite powerful. Earth is still in control. Mars has all of the military power and technology, and the people in the belt are sort of the lower class citizens as they work for everything, and they're reliant on Earth and Mars for all of their resources because they're essentially living in a space station and they need all of their air and water and everything delivered to them. This story is told from two perspectives. Jim Holden is the executive officer aboard an ice mining rig, and his crew come across a derelict ship, the Scopuli, that has been abandoned, and they go to investigate, and while they investigate, their ice hauler is destroyed by a mysterious ship. Holden and the crew that he have left have to survive and escape. Basically, they find themselves in possession of this secret that Holden really wants to tell everyone, which gets him into a lot of trouble, but they have to unravel sort of the mystery because otherwise they'll find themselves forever on the run. And this secret has the potential to ignite a war between the different factions of humanity. Second perspective is that of Detective Miller, who lives in the belt. He is sort of this jaded detective / private security force member who is given the task of finding a woman who has disappeared. Her name is Julie, and her parents are wealthy business owners on Luna, and they want her found and returned to them by any means necessary. Eventually he's called off the case, but he has become gripped by the mystery surrounding Julie, and he decides to follow through, and eventually his paths cross with Holden and his crew and the war that has begun. There is so much going on in this book. This required a lot of thought in a good way, and I really enjoyed it because there's so much politics, there's so many different contrasting personalities that bring everyone into conflict. There is this war that's going on. There is this really wonderful world and landscape that's been described in such great detail. Like, you can really picture it in your head. I love that because it's gritty, it's raw, it's exciting, it's compelling, and I highly recommend you pick it up. I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. Next, I read How to Be by Bren McDibble. This is an Australian middle grade fiction book, and it is the story of Peony, who is living in a world that is sort of dystopian-like in that what if the bee population in the world can no longer sustain the growing of crops, and bees are so rare that now children have to become bees and have to hand pollinate flowers on farms. Peony really wants to become a bee. She's lived on a farm her whole life with her grandfather and her older sister. She knows the farm like the back of her hand, and she's so close to becoming a bee. She's really well respected by the farm's foreman, who looks after all of the kids. And the kids all have jobs on the farm, so some of them are involved in helping the adults with some of their tasks, or they're pests, so they actually go through and they have to manually clear pests off the fruit trees by grabbing them off and throwing them down to the chooks, which is quite an interesting concept. And then there are the bees, who are sort of the highest tier of the kids' jobs. The people who are on these farms aren't paid a wage, but they are paid in their food, and they seem to be well treated by the foreman and the farm owners, which I was pleasantly surprised about. One day, however, Peony's mother arrives, and Peony's mother has been working in the city for a long time. She has decided to take Peony with her into the city, that Peony is going to work with her and earn a living, which obviously Peony and the rest of her family disagree with. However, once Peony is there, she begins to work in the house of a wealthy urban family. It's one of those complete chalk and cheese worlds where Peony is like the square peg trying to fit in the round hole in that world. She's a country girl, and she's used to having free reign of everything that she's doing and having a set schedule, and she can't understand why this wealthy family can't do anything for themselves. She eventually strikes up a very interesting but relatable friendship with the daughter of this family, and the story goes on from there. At first when I read this book, I had a little bit of trouble getting into it. It takes a minute to wrap your head around the world. And once I had a clearer picture of what was going on, it was fine, and I read it and I really enjoyed this book. But it does take a minute, and there is some interesting slang that goes on, which is what gives this book an almost dystopian feel. It's not dystopian, but it has that atmosphere of something's gone wrong with the world and this is the result of it. It's trying to do a lot of things, and I think it does most of them pretty well. The relationship between Peony and her mother is really interesting and really sad. There's a confronting element of domestic abuse in this story, and you have to be aware of that going into it, because if you're reading this with kids or kids are reading it, you need to be able to talk that through. But ultimately it is the story of a girl who has a wonderful dream of becoming a bee, and that's her pinnacle. That's what she really wants to do, and she goes after it with everything that she's got. So she's persistent and she is relentless and she's a strong character, and I really like that about her. She doesn't ever give up. Ultimately, I gave How to Be 4 out of 5 stars. Well worth a read. The last book that I read this week was 1,000 Pieces of You by Claudia Gray, which is another young adult science fiction book, but this time we have our main characters traveling between alternate dimensions, which was a nice change of pace from Outer Space books this week. Marguerite Kane is the daughter of 2 very prominent physicists who have unlocked the potential for people's consciousness to travel to alternate dimensions and inhabit the bodies of their doppelgangers in those worlds. Everything's going really well until Marguerite's father is murdered and Marguerite's world is turned upside down. Her parents have 2 proteges, Paul and Theo, and Paul is accused of murdering her father, and Theo has decided that he is going to go travelling after Paul to bring him back to justice, and Marguerite decides that she is going to go along with him. All of the characters in this book were really interesting. I wish Marguerite had been a little bit of a stronger character, and in some ways she was and in some ways she wasn't. Quite often she ended up being the damsel who had to be saved, which was a little bit irritating. Perhaps later in the series she actually becomes more confident and assertive in that sense. And she does towards the end of this book. She begins to make decisions for herself and try and keep herself safe. Both Paul and Theo were really interesting male lead characters as well. And there is this sort of love triangle that's going on, but once Marguerite makes a decision, she's actually quite unwavering in that. So in that respect, it's not really a love triangle. All of the characters in all of the different alternate dimensions that they visit were really nuanced, and I really enjoyed reading about those characters. I especially loved reading about the descriptions of the different worlds. So Marguerite lives in a world that's very much like our own, and the first time that she travels to an alternate dimension, she ends up in a futuristic London, which is the London at the top of this page. The second time that she travels, she ends up in Russia, and it's a present day Russia, but it is still ruled by a Tsar. So there's some really nice twists on past and present technology and the role of technology in society. Then she ends up in a world that is very, very similar to her own, with only slight differences. And she also ends up in a world where some of the population of Earth are now living underwater in underwater stations because climate change has happened and the water levels have risen, and it's actually one of the safest places to be. The other thing that I really liked was this concept of consciousness traveling to different bodies, because I think it sort of highlights how difficult it would be to actually move matter between dimensions. And alongside this, there brings in this question of moral and ethical decisions when you're inhabiting someone else's body, because these people aren't you, they're actually their own individual people, but you're inhabiting their mind and controlling everything that they do, and how much do they remember and how much of what they're feeling is what you're feeling, and vice versa. In a lot of reviews that I've read, a lot of people had concerns over that sort of moral and ethical behaviour. However, it would have been really easy for Claudia Gray not to discuss that in her book and just to accept it as fact, but she did bring it up, the characters discuss it, and was it as in-depth as it probably should have been? Probably not, but it's still brought up, and it's still brought to the reader's attention that these characters know that the actions that they take while inhabiting other people's bodies will have consequences. Are they around to see what those consequences are? No, because they've moved on. Especially as Marguerite constantly moves on, she begins to question whether what she's doing is the right thing and whether she has the right to use her doppelgangers' bodies in the way that she wants to. Ultimately, I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It was a fun read. I really enjoyed the relationships in here. I really enjoyed all of the characters, and I'm really excited to continue reading the other books in the Firebird series. So that's everything that I read this week. Really interesting week. Nice mix of different types of science fiction and some other books thrown in there. just to break it up, because sci-fi can be heavy, man. Gosh. Let me know in the comments what you have been reading recently, anything that you've been enjoying. Let me know down below, and if you've read any of the books that I have read, please let me know your thoughts on them, because I would love to hear them. I hope that wherever you are in the world, you're having a wonderful day. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you on Wednesday. Bye.